When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked, and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
I'd be driving along and see a young girl. I'd go out and talk to her and try to persuade her to get into the van.
This is the voice of a serial killer from beyond the grave, one of the worst child murderers in British criminal history.
The image that came to me when I was having to read the details of this man's crime was of descending into a cave where it was darker the deeper I went, such that if you shone a light in the darkest place, it would be reflected in the dead, depraved eyes of Robert Black.
Between 1981 and 1986, Robert Black abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 4 girls between the ages of 5 and 11. He is suspected of killing many more. Whilst Black never admitted to murder during his time in prison, where he died in 2016, he did agree to a series of interviews where he openly talked about crimes against children, which he always claimed never extended beyond abduction and molestation. These interviews are graphic and disturbing.
Put that pillowcase or whatever it was, a cushion cover over her head. Put her into the sleeping bag. And now I just slung her gone.
His reign of terror saw parents keep their kids off the street and destroyed the notion of childhood for a generation.
When I grew up, we played in the street. Kids don't play in the street anymore. And one of the reasons, I think, was because Robert Black created a kind of terror that made parents afraid to have their children out of their sight.
I don't understand myself. I keep asking myself, why? I got this fascination or weakness or whatever I want to call it.
Would he proudly describe himself as a serial killer? No, he would not. He would describe himself as the unfortunate victim of life.
Black's career as one of the worst paedophilic killers the UK has ever known was only ended by chance. On the 14th of July 1990, a man in a white van was seen behaving suspiciously in the Scottish border town of Stowe.
A man who was working in his garden in a suburban street saw a van pull up and a little girl who was just going to the shop 100 yards down the road. He pulled up next to her, opened the door and started talking to the little girl, and the man thought, this is a bit strange. And then suddenly he saw the little girl being lifted into the car. Fortunately, he had the number plate of the car, noted it down, and called the police immediately. And while he was saying what he'd seen, suddenly Black drove by again. So, of course, the police give chase. They get the van open at the back, and they look in, and the policeman who's looking in sees the sleeping bag there and gets the child out, who's puce because it's so hot and unable to speak because she's so totally frightened. And lo and behold, it's his own daughter.
With the policeman's daughter discovered bound and gagged in the back of his van, Black was swiftly arrested on charges of abduction and sexual assault. In August 1990, he pled guilty as charged and was sentenced to life in prison. But so sophisticated was the preparation and execution of the crime, police were convinced that this was not the first time Black had carried out such an attack. They believed he had in fact unwittingly revealed a deadly MO he had perfected over time. With Black now behind bars and refusing to talk, police called in world-renowned criminal profiler Professor Paul Britton to ask for his advice on whether Black could have been guilty of other previous crimes. This is the first time he has discussed his involvement in the case.
I first became aware of Robert Black when I had a telephone call from the police in Scotland asking me if I would give an opinion on the contents of the back of a van. And they flew down to my office. They brought with me materials and photographs and went through a situation that they'd encountered and asked me what it meant in terms of psychological functioning and a person who might have been involved. What I saw was what amounts to an abduction and rape kit. You saw the carpeting, the material that the girl had been rolled into, but much more than that, you saw how everything had been brought and prepared, and you knew that in the circumstance that she was in and the route that the van was going, that it was only a matter of time before she would be literally killed. And without knowing the abduction in detail of the little girl that he had taken and had been reclaimed, it fell to me to tell them that this was very similar to the 3 girls who had been abducted in other places and left across the country.
Detectives began looking at the disappearance of murdered children all across the country to see whether they bore the hallmark of Black's abduction. Some 8 years previously, on August the 12th, 1982, the body of 11-year-old Susan Maxwell was found dumped beside a road in Uttoxeter, central England. She had been raped and strangled. This was followed on July the 8th, 1983, by the disappearance of 5-year-old Caroline Hogg from the Portobello Fair in Edinburgh. Her body had also been found dumped in a ditch many miles from her home. In March 1986, another young girl would disappear, 10-year-old Sarah Harper from Morley, Leeds, who'd gone 100 yards down the road from her home for a loaf of bread. Her lifeless body was found floating in the River Trent near Nottingham. All 3 bodies had been transported hundreds of miles, but deposited within a 26-mile radius of each other. Although police couldn't link all these murders to Black, it was clear that they were dealing with a serial killer. Paul Britton began to make a connection between the methods of subduing and killing discovered in the back of Black's van and the crime scenes of 11-year-old Susan Maxwell and 5-year-old Caroline Hogg.
The first stage was to look at the scene of crime photographs, and tragically, it's a young child, I'm afraid, in a distinct state of early decomposition. And then when you go on into the post-mortem materials, it's clear that it's very difficult to say exactly what it is that's been done, how it's been done. And what you're left with is a need to understand who might have been responsible for what you're seeing. And they all have in common certain features. They have their age in common. They have, in particular, the distance that they have been taken, and that fed into my view of what the police might be looking for. So what you see is a person who has a certain level of confidence, a certain level of indifference also. This is a person who took a child always knowing what was going to happen, always knowing that the child was going to be brutalized, murdered, and then disposed of. And that's what happened.
The police had initially asked Paul Britton to make a profile of the murderer. It would prove to be eerily accurate in recording many of the characteristics of Robert Black.
We were looking at someone who almost certainly had the capacity to travel the length and breadth of the country unnoticed. So it would be something that would be a part of his ordinary everyday work. He wouldn't be outstanding until people began to look more closely. It would be a person who had a vehicle that facilitated that. Probably not just an ordinary saloon car. There would have to be a van or a truck that would allow a child to be put into, dealt with, maybe killed, assaulted in the vehicle, and then left in due course.
Some 5 years later, with Black languishing in prison on a charge of abduction and sexual assault, he was by far the closest police had come to a candidate for Britton's profile. A full investigation was launched into Black's past to see if he could be linked to any outstanding murders. Despite appearing to be cooperative, Black denied all knowledge, offering no helpful information whatsoever. So the police called in one of the UK's leading forensic psychiatrists, Dr. Richard Badcock, to see whether he could breach Black's defences. Despite being in the profession for over 30 years, nothing could have prepared Dr. Badcock for what Black was about to reveal.
He was very unprepossessing physically. He was overweight. He was shy. Not, I think, terribly intelligent, but had a lot of what you might think of as sort of natural cunning. He didn't have lots of opportunities for conversation, so yes, he was quite happy to talk about himself. The initial set of interviews were entirely about trying to help Robert understand himself, in the hope that if he wanted it, that would be able to give him peace of mind, and in turn that would make it easier for him to give up information that he'd so far kept quiet about, but which would help the victims' families. There were areas of his life that he was quite happy to talk about, and equally areas that he wasn't. The areas that he was happy to talk about were things that he'd spoken about with other people. The things he didn't want to talk about very much were the offences. The one thing he did say was that he had no recollection of what happened to the victims in terms of whether they died or not. It was, he said, it was like a theatre, like the curtains opening at the start of a play. What had gone on before the curtains opened, he had no knowledge of. What happened after the curtains closed, he had no recollection of. And these were the areas when the girls were killed and the bodies disposed of. But he had some recollection of what happened in between. What he mostly wanted to get across was how badly he'd been treated at various stages of life. That was his central mantra, as it were.
As Dr. Badcock's interviews with Robert Black continued, it was clear that the killer blamed his downfall on his own upbringing, where he was born into poverty in 1947 in Grangemouth, Scotland.
Unknown father, a mother who didn't want him, a mother who rejected him, a mother who left him, who gave him up for adoption, who fostered him, who left the country, leaving him as a child to foster parents, where he was abused.
Black was raised by his foster parents, Jack and Margaret Tulip. Neighbours frequently reported Robert to be covered in suspicious-looking bruises, believed to have been caused by beatings administered by his foster parents. Black would never be taken out of foster care, and he would never see his mother again. He complained that there was little love in his foster household.
I remember one Christmas I didn't get no Christmas presents because I'd been bad. I got one present, somebody that lived out of town. It was a football. I can't remember what I'd done, like, you know, but she says Santa Claus isn't coming this year to you. And he didn't.
Well, we know Robert had quite a deprived childhood. And I suppose what they show is the persistence of those memories. You know, here he is, a grown man, still going back to that episode of a poor Christmas. I think probably what makes it more potent for him is that it wasn't just not getting a present, it was a sense of being rejected by his parents or the people who should have given him presents. So it's probably the rejection that still rankles.
Unfortunately, while he was reasonably well behaved in the adopted family, that mother too died when he was just 11. So that's twice he's had exclusion from having a regular mother. He was then sent off to a care home, or a series of care homes, one of which he was systematically sexually abused by a male.
At primary school, Black was considered to be a shy and awkward loner by his classmates, who would also bully him because of his perceived lack of hygiene, which may in fact have been self-inflicted, and a sign of a far more disturbing problem to come.
He was indeed known as Smelly Robbie, and he was obsessed with excrement. One of his famous fantasies, and indeed practices, was to, brace yourself, put feces, his own feces, on his own hands and rub them together and smear, that sort of thing. Absolutely charming, I know. But he was obsessed with that sort of thing.
Even at this young age, Black was exhibiting a disturbing array of what psychologists call paraphilia, abnormal sexual desires arising from extreme or dangerous activities.
Black, from quite an early age, but it seems to have persisted, seemed to insert objects up his backside. There is actually photographic evidence of that the police found in his lodgings when he was arrested. Things like a telephone receiver and a wine bottle and that sort of thing. Certainly must have made for a rather unusual photograph album. That sort of activity does seem to suggest that he needed something absorbing to focus on. And sexual activity can sometimes provide that because of its very engrossing nature. It's part of a little world that the individual can construct where they can be in control when the rest of life might not be fully in control.
Another of his paraphilias is that he likes to dress in women's swimwear. He himself wishes that he'd had a vagina and doesn't like his own penis. He was precocious at school, going way beyond the if you show me your eye and I'll show you yours sort of routine, trying to stick his penis into a young girl along with two other lads. They were all inept at it and couldn't do that, but they nevertheless all felt each other and all of that stuff, and it stuck with him. And then at 15, in those days, he was expected to leave the care home and go and find work, which he did, delivering things, not by car, but on foot. Well, he reckons he's molested something like 30 or 40 girls while he had the job there.
There was a girl on her own in the flats when I was delivering. I might sit down and talk to her for a few minutes later. I try and touch her. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes not. It happened fairly right.
Okay. But you don't know how many children?
It could be in the 30s, 40s.
Black's prolific offending as a child molester would reach new heights when he turned 16. He was about to cross a dark new threshold.
I think the episode where he did lure the 7-year-old girl into the air raid shelter, that really represented a step in the direction of something a lot more serious.
It's in the park in Greenock, by the swings. And all the other kids had gone except for the one little girl. And I asked her if she wanted to see a kitten. Everywhere there was kittens. She came with me. And so we were going into it was an air raid shelter, she said. It was dark. She wanted to get out again. She started to cry.
He took her knickers off, laid her down, and systematically explored digitally all about her. And finally, once he'd done all he wanted in that regard, was strangling her. And she seemed to be unconscious, and he left her for dead. But the thing is, she didn't die and was later found wandering the streets with blood everywhere in a complete daze, unable to speak to anybody.
Asphyxiation provides a layer of power. You are very up close and personal in order to asphyxiate someone, particularly if you're using your hands, but also if you use a ligature. You're right there, you're watching that individual, you're feeling that individual. That gives you a tremendous sense of power, of domination over that individual. And there is this link between domination and sex. And in his case, he strangled her till she was unconscious. She may have been dead, he didn't know, but clearly he found this sexually exciting because he then masturbated over her unconscious body, as it turns out, rather than her dead body.
I think I clapped my hand over her mouth, held her down on the ground, with my hand round her throat, and holding her down. And she must have gone unconscious anyway. And I masturbated there. Went out, left her.
And you didn't know whether she was alive or dead?
No.
The fact that he successfully masturbated suggests that he got something immediately from the experience. And it's quite likely that that would stay in his mind and he would develop the thought and it would become incorporated in fantasies. He also wanted passivity. You could argue that it was important to him not to have another presence there. He would just feel it was the wrong thing to do. You know, that it was somehow it was a worse thing to to masturbate over a living child, a conscious child, than it was over an unconscious or a dead one.
When the little girl came around from the attack, she told her parents. Police and social services were soon involved, but it would prove to be a missed opportunity to stop Black's offending behaviour from escalating.
For this, he was interviewed by a psychiatrist who said he wasn't a threat and that he would probably grow out of this. And as a consequence, his punishment for this was that he was admonished. Extraordinary. He was admonished. That constitutes, in the mind of Black, a reward. He got off with it. That was a releasing event in his mind. As I said, he learned then that he could abduct, molest, and possibly kill with impunity.
Having got away with his crime, Black felt emboldened. He moved into new lodgings and almost immediately was reported to the police for molesting the landlady's 6-year-old daughter. This time the offence saw him sentenced to a year-long stretch in Borstal. But Black received no treatment whilst in the brutal Young Offenders Institute, and upon his release he left Scotland. In September 1968, he moved to London, where he enjoyed the anonymity afforded by the big city. He found lodgings in North London, where he would live for the next decade. A man of few friends, he would be seen frequently drinking alone in pubs, lost in his thoughts.
He's somebody who seemed to really, although outwardly conventional, he seemed to have a very strong inner life centred around his sexual preoccupations. So to that extent, he was really quite an outsider. He didn't seem to mix well with others, but it's as if he had his own little world that he was operating all the time and that governed most of his actions.
Robert's life was not a normal one. It was a very introverted one, very introspective, very narcissistic. His contact with the outside world wasn't through people, it was through pornography.
There was a place where I first discovered the child pornography, a shop down near King's Cross in London. Didn't have a name, it was just like a shop front. You went in, there was like old books lined up, but you wanted to get something else. You went in the back.
That was all child pornography?
No, I made the chance remark. I said, had he any like teenage sex magazines? He says, I've got these. And he hauled them out. They're called lollytots.
The existence of bodies of pornography, even before the internet, would in a sense provide a kind of validation for his sexual interests. It would indicate that he's not the only one, that this is something that's being catered for. That could, in a sense, normalise things to a degree, knowing that he's not the only one.
As Black's fantasies darkened, so his impulses began to escalate. It was no longer enough to buy pornography. He wanted to make his own.
Well, I know he built up a big collection. I was given one of his books to look at, and it was on the front cover. It was a number 101. So you knew he had a huge collection. The interesting thing about this particular book was that the images in it had all been culled from magazines, but they weren't necessarily horrible sexual images. A lot of them were about sort of naked, smiling children, you know, health and deficiency stuff, with a few conventional adult pictures, but the majority were of children. But they weren't of children being abused. These were of children displaying innocence. And I assume that that was one of the attractions for him, is the innocence of childhood. The thing that he must have felt had been taken away from him. That, I think, was part of the envy.
Black was forever looking for ways to bring him into contact with children in a way that would not draw suspicion. And he found the perfect opportunity by working as a swimming pool attendant, which afforded him the ability to spy on young girls.
I think with Black, there was no sense of connection with other people, which is a very important part of human life. And if people don't have that sense of mutual understanding with other people, if they don't live in a world where there's connectedness with others, then it's as if, well, what's inside them has free rein to just generate its own sense, even though it might make little sense to those outside. Things like their own sense of meaning, their own need for control, their own sense of identity can just take off and be increasingly out of step with the world of other people.
Many people have fantasies, in this case sexual fantasies, deviant, abusive fantasies, and that is all they have. With Black, you have a person who began to bring them to reality. How does that start? It starts off with looking. So no longer imagining, no longer looking at pornography on a page or a screen, but actually going out and finding and looking at a child. And then they begin to follow. And then they begin to incorporate that child into their fantasies. And then, if they're at all bright, they begin to work out the how-tos. How do you do that? What are the problems? What do you need to overcome? And so that's what he began to do.
In 1976, Black found a job that would help fulfill his paedophilic fantasies. He found work as a van driver delivering posters, in a role that would take him all over the country and indeed Europe. He was constantly on the lookout for potential victims.
A lot of, sex offenders more generally will use memory of past offences as sexual stimulation. And I think he did talk about often masturbating in the back of his van and thinking about past offences, including the 7-year-old that he abducted and nearly killed through strangling many years earlier. Also, as part of his masturbation routine, it seems that he had young girls' clothing in the back of his van, and he particularly liked dressing up in young girls' swimming costumes. So, at least some of the time, he was gaining sexual gratification in that kind of way. But it seems that the possibility of abducting, sexually molesting, even killing a victim was never far from his thoughts.
You need to understand he was an obsessive compulsive. The obsession is in the mind. The compulsion is in the deed. And he was doing both. He was rehearsing. He was fantasizing. Fantasizing is a form of rehearsing. And he was rehearsing in the extent of not only the aspect of the act itself, but in how he would escape detection, how he would escape punishment and arrest. So he had become adroit in his own sadistic little world.
I don't think that Black tripped over into murder. I think that it is a, for him, natural but escalating pathway, because it's never the case that the fantasy stays still. It always has to develop. It always needs a little more. And for Black, one of the things that gave him that fulfillment was the death of the child. And in addition to that, once the child's dead, they're not going to identify you.
In his later police interview, Black revealed the chilling MO he used to abduct children.
Tied her hands, found a sticky plaster, put the plaster over her mouth, put that pillowcase or whatever it was, like cushion cover over her head, put her into the sleeping bag, and now I just slung it in the corner.
That was Robert's MO, was to abduct quickly, put a tape over, cover them up, bundle them in the back of the van, and then ignore them. The actual aspect of creating the death of the victims was something he always sort of dissociated himself from. It wasn't something that he was particularly interested in. His focus of attention was what he could do once he had a body. And at the time, he must have also paid attention to what he would do afterwards. But after the event, he would dissociate himself from that as well. So he would, in terms of his conscious recollection, he'd cut himself off from the creation of the death and the disposal of the body.
Black demonstrated a trait found in many serial killers who avoid detection for a long period: guile and cunning. His work as a van driver meant he could find victims across a huge geographic area, and also have a safe space within which to assault and murder them before transporting them to their deposition site. Dr. Samantha Lundrigan is one of the UK's leading geographic profilers, and she believes Robert Black's knowledge of the roads enabled him to become the prolific offender he did.
He used his legitimacy as a delivery driver to be in the places where he disposed of his victims' bodies. He selected deposition sites that were in lay-bys, so he didn't have to drive too far off the main highway, where lots of lorries and vans stopped, so he would not have attracted any attention. And then he was very adept at taking his moment to move the bodies of his victims and discard them, really. There was no attempt even really to hide them. I think the most significant reason for why he was so difficult to catch for so long was because of the way he used his environment. It was his geography. It was the fact that he covered so many hundreds of miles across a country with many, many different police forces, that his crimes weren't linked for a long time. With the distance that he put between his base and where he committed his crimes came the safety for him. That distance afforded him the freedom to carry on offending for as long as he did.
Serial offenders of whatever variety do learn as they go along. They learn how not to be caught, they learn where things go wrong and they need to adjust what they do. But much more importantly, I think what happens is their fantasy life evolves. And so that what is successful and satisfactory at one stage of their murderous career becomes inadequate for the next stage and the next stage. And the terrible thing about these depraved fantasies is that there is no way of ultimately reaching the reward that they want, and so they have to keep going and going.
If Black had not been caught in the act, he would almost certainly have committed many more murders. But once the police had him in custody, even though he had not confessed to his crimes, his obsession with keeping trophies would lead to his conviction. And it all came down to his love of vans and the road.
I was on duty at Scotland Yard on the day that he was arrested and had to brief the Commissioner about his arrest. And I think the really frightening thing was the rapidity with which he struck and the way in which he pulled along in his van back past the area to go and fill up the van with petrol. And it was one of the first things he did after he'd taken a child, is go and fill the van with petrol. And the reason he did that was because the receipt for the petrol was his souvenir. And when his house that he rented a room in Stoke Newington was searched painstakingly over a number of days, eventually they found a cache of souvenirs, many of which were petrol receipts, which placed him in the crucial areas on the crucial days. Nothing else, not bits of victims, not bits of clothing, not photographs, petrol receipts.
The petrol receipts would help to convict Black of the murder of 4 girls, but never once did he confess to those crimes.
He said that he wasn't guilty. He never showed, if you like, any remorse or regret for what had happened. He insisted that it was nothing to do with him. When people are in denial, it means they themselves are able to persuade themselves that it didn't happen. Now, in Black's case, that almost certainly isn't the case. This is a man who knew what he'd done, who inside revelled in it, who revisited it, who in his dreams and fantasies went back through it. He may have absolved himself of any guilt or responsibility, but he wasn't denying it to himself, but he's certainly not going to give you the power of knowing that he's done it unless you have a particular way of accessing him.
It was a drive that took him over. He didn't want to control it. He surrendered his will to it. It was destructive, but made him feel powerful, made him feel effective, made him feel better, more than it made him feel guilty.
If you're a paedophile, you can't do anything about it. All you can do is stop doing it. And the best way of dealing with that, in my opinion, is to say, look, if you go within 250 yards of a school entrance, you'll be back in, and that's it, and you'll stay in. That's the only way of dealing with it. All you can do is stop them doing it, not wanting to do it. And that's a subtle but very important difference.
Robert Black was associated with the disappearance and murder of 10 young girls. But what ultimately was responsible for creating such a monster?
It's certainly clear that something very traumatic happened to him at a very early age, which he never discussed, presumably in the form of sexual abuse, but something which so disturbed him that he shut himself off from it completely, dissociated himself from it. That traumatic something then didn't by itself direct the rest of his life, because he then made decisions as a child growing up and as an adult which added to the capacity to offend. But it was the thing that, because he could never address it or deal with it, stopped him from being able to develop along different lines. So it did have the effect of encouraging him to grow up feeling vulnerable, alienated, inadequate.
Monster is one of the pejoratives that people use to enable them to distance themselves, to categorize someone and set them aside from us. We're reassured. We're not monsters. We couldn't be monsters. It's a separate category. It's a comforting and unrealistic construct. He wasn't a monster. He was a product of that particular life.
Despite all of the predisposing factors, Robert Black always had a choice. Everything that he did in terms of the abduction and the offending against children was planned, thought about, carried out over time. In each case, there were many, many points at which he could have said stop, at which he could have asked for help, at which he could have looked for intervention. He didn't do any of those things truly. In fact, what he did is he looked to frustrate the occurrence of any one of those all the way through.
He couldn't have been treated. This was in his nature. This was what he was. I don't think he was retrievable. And there's no punishment sufficient to mark the magnitude of his crimes. He was beyond redemption.